Stand for the reading. In the homily today, I want to address my belief that planet Earth isn't just a rock with life on it, that planet Earth, in fact, is a great soul that animated a rock. So in order to point up the sacredness and the divinity in nature, I want to read a poem which I wrote myself several months ago, and I think I may have sent it out at one stage in the musings. I called it An Ordinary Walk. It started out as an ordinary walk, my typical sleepwalking. Then I woke up and my senses shifted dimensions. A gentle voice teasingly asked, "Do you see what I see?" And then the veil lifted. Every tree leaf became a portal, beckoning me into the beyond. Every breath I took was inspired by Ruach Yahweh, inviting me to rebirth myself again and again and again. Every firm footfall of mine touched the belly of Gaia, the mother who gave me life and food and clothes and a home. Every shallow little puddle became a mirror of the sky, showing me the heavens miles above me. Every daffodil became the golden chalice of the Last Supper. Even a fallen, long-dead, rotting tree trunk became a sapling that once waved in the wind as Jesus walked the dusty roads of Galilee, speaking of the Father to the God-hungry peasants. Every plodding donkey on the way thought nostalgically of the time when he bore the fleeing family into Egypt and later the triumphant Messiah into Jerusalem. Every cloud became the veil of Veronica, cooling his fevered brow on the long, painful journey to Golgotha. Every large stone became a brother of the one which afforded Jesus the privacy of the tomb, making it a thin place for 3 days as he readied his body for resurrection. To each, as I encountered them, I silently intoned Namaste. For what is Namaste but the recognition of the resurrection in each one of us, the awakened and the sleeping alike, whether donkey or human, breath or cloud or stone, puddle or footfall, tree trunk or tree leaf or daffodil. There is no such thing as an ordinary walk. Words inspired by God.
Thanks be to God.
ÓLaoire is the deepest lake in Ireland. It's 50 meters deep. And it's an ocean lake. There's a tiny little channel that feeds the ocean into this inland lake. And it's very, very, very narrow channel. So an amazing thing happens. When the tide is rising in the ocean, it tries to spill through this little causeway. And because the causeway is too narrow to accommodate a great volume of water, what happens is it's like a little waterfall flowing from the ocean into the lake. And then the lake level rises quite high, and when the tide goes down on the outside, it spills back down, so there's like a little waterfall going in the opposite direction until they find their balance. And the water in this little lake is very different from what you find in the rest of Ireland. So there are fish and octopi in that little lake that you don't find again until you go as far south as Portugal in the Atlantic Ocean. And divers come from all over the world to dive in this lake. So it's about 6 miles from a little town in Ireland called Skibbereen, and quite near where my father lived for the last 30 years of his life. And so on the 27th of July, 1997, he brought me to ÓLaoire. I'd never seen it before. And we spent hours there just oohing and eyeing and watching. We came at the turn of the tide. So we're watching it spill into the lake, for a period of time and then spill back out of the lake again. And as we were leaving, he said, there's a holy well somewhere near here. Let me see if I can find where it is. So we walk back along the little boreen from the lake, and we look around, and he finally finds it. It's inside in a wooded area, and it's a tiny little thing. The circumference isn't much bigger than a dinner plate, and the depth isn't much bigger than a pot. But there was this extraordinary energy around it, and there were little flagstones there. So it was obvious immediately we were in a thin place. So the little flagstones, I knelt on the flagstones, and we stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, wrapped in just deep meditation. And it was interesting as I shifted my focus of my eyes. When I looked in, I could see the underside of a huge big oak tree right above us. I could see the underside of the leaves. And then I looked a little bit deeper. I could see the puffy clouds above the tree. And then deeper, I could see the azure blue sky right over it. And then I changed my focus. I look in, and the little thing is about this depth. So now I could see just the mud on the bottom and leaves which had sunk. And then I changed my focus again, and it seemed to me like I was looking right through the earth, right down to the antipodes. And I was looking at the underside of an oak tree in Australia. And I was looking at white puffy clouds, in the southern hemisphere, and I was looking at an azure blue sky in the south. And then I changed it one last time, and it seemed to me like I wasn't looking down at Australia or at Ireland anymore. I was looking at the very soul of planet Earth. And at that stage, I saw there was a little handwritten notice that identified this little holy well, and it was called Tubarín na Suil, which in Gaelic literally means the little well of the eyes. And tradition had it, this was an ancient well that predated Christianity. Old Celtic, druidical holy well. And had the reputation of curing diseases of the eyes. So it's called Tubarín na Suil, the little well of the eyes. Now, thanks be to God, my eyes are perfect. I didn't have any eye problems. But I splashed it on my eyes for a few moments. And I made a wish, or asked for a blessing. And the blessing was that I would be able to recognize a thin place when I encountered it, whether it was in a location or whether it was in a person. Because I'm totally convinced that thin places don't just occur in physical or geographical locations. I've met people, and I'm sure you've met people, whom I would call walking tabernacles or walking thin places. People who literally radiate that kind of energy. And so that was the blessing I asked for myself, that I would be able to recognize thin places and thin people when I encounter such people. And gratefully, I've had the privilege of meeting such people in my lifetime. But mostly, I wanted to be able to see the thin place, which is the planet itself, not just this little holy well, or not just other designated places like Fatima or Lourdes or Medjugorje or places like that. Be able to realize that the planet herself actually is a thin place. And that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. Beginning at that stage, that was July 27, 1997, I had a series of 4 very important visions of the planet over the next few years. And they're the 4 points I want to make this morning. So I'll make 4 main points this morning in the homily. And the first one I will call Gaia, the volunteer. And then secondly, the pregnant planet. Then thirdly, moving the rock. And then fourthly, beings of light. So they're the 4 points I'll make. And they're all referring to the planet. They're all visions ahead of the planet over the subsequent years. So the first one is Gaia, the volunteer. So I had this really profound experience where I saw souls presenting themselves to God, to Source, volunteering for incarnation. Because not all souls volunteer just to be human beings. Souls can volunteer to take up any kind of a spacesuit in any dimension. And so souls were coming in front of God and, volunteering. And there was this one great soul, I'm going to call her Gaia, who volunteered, and she said to God, I want to animate that third rock from the sun in that solar system, and I'm going to breed life there. And I'm going to keep experimenting until I manage to breed a life form that will be capable of recognizing its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms. And she said about it, 3.7 billion years ago, she took this rock in space and she animated it. It became her space suit. And she began to breed life. Initially just protozoa, single-celled creatures. And then more complicated forms, multicellular organisms, fish in the sea. And then at some stage, amphibians who are at home both on land and sea. And then eventually the great reptiles. And then mammals, those who tend their young after they've given birth to them, unlike the reptiles. And then hominids of various kinds. And she kept on breathing until we're on the verge of a species that could recognize its own divinity and the divinity of all the other life forms that we share the planet with. So that was kind of what I saw there. And as I think about that today, it just occurs to me, I look after my car fairly well, not great. Every time my brother comes out, he looks after it better for me. So he gets it in good shape for the next year until he visits again. But I look after it because I put gas in it, and I put oil in it, and I put water in the windscreen washer, so I'm doing my job. And I'm doing it because it's a resource. I need it to get places. So I'm committed to it only because it's a resource. And I know that, come next year again, it'll get a major overhaul. And I look after my house, because it's a resource, and I vacuum it at least once a year. And I clean the windows occasionally, and then Seamus comes out once a year and he does all the major repairs, like changing light bulbs up 25 feet in the air, that kind of stuff. And I look after it the way I do because it's a resource. It provides a home for me and shelter for me and safety for me. And then I think of the planet. Are we looking after the planet or using the planet because it's a resource? Are we looking after it because it's much more than a resource? It's not a resource, even though it provides our bodies. Every cell in your body was given you by your mother, the earth. So it's not a resource, even though it gave you your food, it gave you your body, it gave you shelter. Every house you live in is built from materials that it produced. Everything you see on the planet is built from materials that it produced. So this mother of ours, we don't respond to her or take care of her simply because she's a resource. We do it because she's our mother and she's this extraordinary soul. This, I think, is why this should be our relationship to the planet. It is not a resource. It is our mother that gave us life. So it's a totally different kind of relationship we have to her. So I then began to ask myself the question after this vision, at what level do souls get introduced into the equation of incarnation? So, Christians would believe that the only beings that have souls are human beings. And I asked myself the question, is that true? Are humans the only beings that have souls? And it's obviously not. Obviously, angels have souls, but much more importantly, animals have souls, I'm convinced. So I began to look at it, and it seems to me that there are gradations of souls that volunteer for more and more complex life forms. It seems to me that every single cell has a soul attached to it. I call that a simple soul. There's an intelligence attached to even an atom. It knows how to keep its electrons and its nucleus in balance. There's some kind of a soul animating that process. We get a bit more complicated. So there are 70 trillion cells in the human body. At some stage, they begin to form communities of various kinds. And some of them dedicate themselves to becoming eye cells. Some dedicate themselves to becoming heart cells. And so this cluster, this community of cells, has its own kind of soul. Maybe you would call it a super soul. So it's a different level of soul. It's not just the combination of the souls who went into making it. It has its own special soul. When you think of the organs of a body, the entire organism, you've got a heart and lungs and kidneys and eyes and everything else, it seems to me there's another level of soul that animates that process. Maybe you're going to call it a mega soul of some kind. And then you get a whole bunch of human beings together as a species. And I believe there's another soul, a greater soul still, that animates us as a species. Not just the individual souls, inside the core of each one of us, but the soul of the species. I think there's a soul to the planet. I think a galaxy has a soul. I think the cosmos has a soul. So for me, there are souls all the way through this process. So when I look at planet Earth then, I don't see planet Earth just as a rock that sprouted life. There's a little creek that flows through where I live, and very often there'll be a rock in the middle of the river, and somehow a bird has dropped a seed there, and there's a plant growing out straight out of the rock. I don't believe that that's what happened in planet Earth. I don't think planet Earth is just a rock that somehow sprouted life artificially. I think it is a rock that got animated by a great soul who bred life and kept breeding life until finally we get a species which might be capable of recognizing its own divinity and ipso facto the divinity of all the other life forms with which we share the planet. So that's the evolution, it seems to me. Different levels of souls. Now, I think that any soul, no matter how profound or advanced it might be, might choose to animate a lily. A soul might decide to spend an entire incarnation animating a single lily, if for the sheer fun of the experience. But more and more, it seems to me that more advanced souls would want to animate more complex life forms. And certainly, planet Earth is a much more complex life form than you or me. Much more complex. So it calls for an extraordinary level of soul to be able to animate a planet which produces literally millions of different species, and to finally produce a species which might recognize its own divinity, and ipso facto, the divinity of all other life forms. If anybody were to get to the stage where they feel they're God, and they don't realize that everybody else and everything else is God, you're just talking about a narcissist. You're not talking about an avatar here. And so I think there are souls right through this entire process. Now, I think there's an evolution that's happened as Earth has produced this extraordinary series of phenomena. So, we start off with this physiosphere, literally a rock. And then there's a sheath that now covers that rock, which we might call the biosphere, all the life forms, a little sheath of life around it, like plant life and flora and fauna. And then at some stage, there is an atmosphere forms. And for me, an atmosphere is like the etheric body of Gaia, the energy template, which breeds the life forms. Tyler Desjardins talked about another sheath that he called the noosphere, which is like a sheath of consciousness that surrounds the planet. So at some stage, flora and fauna developed another layer of consciousness, self-reflection. And in some senses, the internet or the World Wide Web is an indicator of that there's a connectivity, a conscious connectivity all over the planet right now, just as he predicted. I believe there are 3 more levels to that process. So the next level up, I would call the psychosphere, where it is the field in which our psychic abilities are embedded. The Akashic record, which is available to everybody. Because it is a field, it means that everything in the field is available to everybody in the field. Just like you go on a trip and you take a bunch of photographs, you upload them onto your website, you give the password to everybody else, and they can access your entire adventure. So every experience that every life form has had is embedded in this, I would call it the psychosphere or the Akashic records, and it's available to all of us. That's another level of what the planet is doing. There's a level above that, I would call it the atmosphere, not atmosphere with an O, but with an A, as in Atman. That Atman is the soul that animates us. So there's an atmosphere, there's a soul consciousness surrounding the entire process that we're growing into. And then finally, a sheath that I would call the pneuma sphere. Pneuma as in spirit, the source itself or God itself, that the planet is moving into that realization. So there's a kind of an expansion or a kind of an evolution that's happening in the planet itself. This is not just a dead rock that happened to sprout seeds at some stage. This is a living being. This is an extraordinary intelligence. This is a great soul. Hinduism would call it a Mahatma, that has produced this extraordinary phenomena. So that's kind of reflection on the first vision. A few years later, I had a second vision in which I saw a pregnant woman, in profile. So I'm watching from the side, I see this woman with this big belly. And I can see right into her stomach. And I can see that she's pregnant, but it's a very different kind of a pregnancy. Rather than there being just a single embryo inside her with one umbilical cord attaching the mother to the baby, there were 7 billion different umbilical cords attached to what she was carrying. And I realized that the mother was planet Earth, and that this particular baby was humanity, the human species, but that there were 7 billion totally different umbilical cords attaching, these to the mother. And as I watched, there was what appeared to be a liquid flowing through the umbilical cords. And sometimes, from some quarters, it was pristine and clear, and sometimes it was real gunky and murky. And I watched as, depending on the preponderance of the liquid, whether it was clear and pristine, or whether it was dull and murky, whatever, I noticed the health of the mother changed significantly. And sometimes she looked really listless and wan and enervated, and sometimes she was vital and alive. It had to do with the quality of the liquid that was flowing through it. And as I began to think about it, it seemed to me what was happening was this, that the content of the umbilical cords was the thoughts and the words and the actions of each person. That every single one of us is contributing to the health or to the dis-ease of the mother by the quality of our thoughts, by the quality of our words, and the quality of our actions. So when the net result is that most of us are, thinking thoughts of fear, or anger, or xenophobia, or violence, or speaking angry words, or acting angrily, that we're affecting the health of the mother herself in that process. And I began to think that we're all connected. Einstein's famous formula, E equals mc squared, means that everything reduces to energy. Everything, including our thoughts. Our behavior has more immediate consequences. Our words, the next most immediate consequence, but even our thoughts have a consequence as well. The thoughts we entertain affect everybody else. And I began to think of the second most important scientific formula of the 20th century was by an Irish physicist, a guy called John Bell, in the 1960s, who created what was called the law of entanglement, where literally every subatomic particle in the universe is connected to other particles. They can't be separated. You interfere with one, you interfere with the whole thing. And it's been proved by a famous French physicist experimentally. John Bell came up with it as a theory. A French physicist showed that it's actually true. Everything is connected to everything else. So every thought I think, every word I speak, every action I engage in has effects. And this is why Jesus would say very famously one time, you will be held accountable for every idle word. Now, Jesus is not saying that God is some kind of a cosmic CPA who's keeping records. Oh, Seán ÓLaoire, bad boy, you said a bad thing. It's not like that. It's that the thought itself has an energy. The words themselves have energy. The thoughts, the words, and the deed all have energy. And they ripple out through space and through time. And I understood for the first time ever that this really is what the concept of original sin is about. Original sin is not a phenomenon, according to Augustine's version of it, where kids are conceived in sin at the moment of orgasm when parents are most out of control and when they're most ungodlike, and then it's when the child is conceived. And therefore, there's some kind of, the soul itself, it has original sin. That's not what happens. What happens is that every little baby is born into a world that has been created by us and our ancestors. So all the thoughts, all the words, all the actions of previous generations have created literally a soup into which babies are born, or a lake into which kids are born and swim. So what is the quality of the water in that lake? Is it a lake which is murky and filthy and full of toxins because it's been created by people who are toxic in their thinking and toxic in their conversations and toxic in their actions? Or is it a place of beauty? Is it pristine waters which will nurture the children? Original sin is the fact mostly we born our children, we birth our children into the toxic waters created by our thought processes, our actions and our words, generation after generation of warmongering peoples. So that for me is what, that was the lesson I learned from the second vision. The third vision had to do with, I call it moving the rock. It was a vision I had of, this time, a huge rock with 7 billion ropes attached to it. It's like the umbilical cords now had become ropes. And each person has a rope and they're trying to pull the rock in their own particular direction. And the person pulling the rock or the rope is the individual ego. So there's 7 billion of us on the planet, and we're all trying to impose our will on reality on the planet. So we're all pulling it in our own unique direction. Now, there's a branch of mathematics called vector analysis. A vector is a commodity that has both magnitude and direction. So, for instance, speed is not a vector. If I tell you I'm driving at 40 miles an hour, that's not a vector. There's a magnitude, 40 miles an hour. But if I say to you, I'm going 40 miles an hour in a northeast direction, now I've given you a velocity. And velocity is a vector. It has magnitude and it has direction. So very, very simply, I was able to sum up the forces being employed here from 7 billion different people all pulling in their own directions, and I could decide immediately and very accurately you know, what direction the rock was actually going to move in and at what speed. Just by summing the forces and the directions, I could tell you specifically where the rock is going to go and at what speed. And I was headed for a cliff. We were pulling the entire thing over the cliff. And the rock represented, in some senses, planet Earth. You know, and the ropes represented the individual egos who were all trying to force our will on the planet. But as I looked more closely, I began to realize there weren't actually 7 billion ropes attached to it. There were perhaps only 30 or 40. So there were clusters of people pulling in the same direction with the same kind of an agenda. And then I began to realize, who are these, you know, who organized that? And it was organized by what I'm going to call the meme makers. Now, meme is a very interesting concept. It, you know, was only defined a few years ago. But basically, a meme is an idea which has great attraction so that it brings a whole bunch of followers. And a meme then becomes the building block of a culture. So, for instance, a meme is to a culture what a gene is to an organism. An organism is composed of genes. They're the building blocks of the particular organism. So the organism orchestrates, organizes itself around the particular genes. Cultures organize themselves around particular ideas. Now, the ideas do not have to be true, and they do not have to be good. As long as they give credibility and a whole bunch of people begin following them, they become hugely, hugely instrumental in creating our reality and creating our future. And so I could see very, very clearly that there are basically maybe 30 or 40 great memes that are pulling this rock in particular directions. So you have to be really, really careful who the meme makers are. Otherwise, we're headed for distraction. And so it's quite easy to recognize a meme. A lot of them will have isms at the end of them. So capitalism would be a meme. Communism would be a meme. Catholicism would be a meme. Consumerism would be a meme. Nationalism would be a meme. So any place you see an ism at the end of a word, you're probably dealing with a meme, some kind of an organizational idea which has extraordinarily attractive power, even if it's totally based on lies, even if it leads to all kinds of warfare. If you get enough people pulling and believing in that, you're going to pull the whole system in that direction. So it becomes really, really important then how we organize. So how do we figure out which rope to get behind? We can only figure that out by elevating way, way, way above the field in which the action is happening. You can't determine that very often down in the trenches. We're just pulling on the rope because other people told you this was the rope to pull on. Or the mass media told you this was the rope to pull on. Or the politicians are telling you this was the rope to pull on. Our religious leaders are telling us these are the ropes to pull on. You have to figure out for yourself. You have to elevate way, way above the action and find out where is the rock, where is it actually being pulled toward. Is it going over the cliff or is it being to safety? So you have to elevate by changing your state of consciousness, either through meditation or through prayer or some form where you're way, way above the field so you can literally see where everybody is pulling, what their agendas are and where it's going to wind up. So that becomes really, really important then as we put our backs to the particular rock. That was the third vision. And the fourth vision, some years later, it's almost like to try to balance the kind of the almost despair created by the middle two, was a vision I had, and it's very like an old Hebrew teaching. There's a great teaching in Hebrew of the 12 tzaddikim. Tzaddiks are the Hebrew word for like an incarnated avatar. And according to esoteric Judaism, there are 12 tzaddiks on planet Earth at any stage of human history, holding the planet together. And often the individual tzaddik may not even realize she is a tzaddik, and she may not even know or be in communication with the other tzaddikim. But together, they're holding the whole thing together. They're beings of light that are actually keeping the whole show together, otherwise it would disintegrate completely. So in my vision, I saw it a little bit differently, because I got a vision of the globe, and I could see all the lines of latitude, all the way up to the North Pole and all the way down to the South Pole, and I could see the lines of longitude. And at the intersection point of each line of latitude and a line of longitude, and at the North Pole and at the South Pole, I could see a being of light, an angelic being of light. They were like holding the grid of the planet together in love. And when the meditation was finished, I calculated what it was. If you multiply the number of lines of latitude by lines of longitude and add in the North and South Pole, you get 64,442 beings of light. Now, it's a symbolic number, obviously. It's not that precise. But that literally the entire planet is being held in the embrace of all these light beings. Gaia did not come in here on her own to try to achieve this extraordinary purpose. She came in here with a plethora of other souls in attendance. And I began to realize that none of us is ever alone. There is no such thing as a lone soul, ever, anywhere in the cosmos. That before we come in, we're not alone. You know, as we prepare for incarnation, we have our mentors, our angelic beings who are getting us ready for it. As we approach what I call the launching pad, where we're about to dive into incarnation, there are angelic beings and mentors assisting us in that process. When the soul begins to dock with the embryo, I don't necessarily believe that a soul docks at the moment of conception. I think it can dock at any stage of the pregnancy. But when it finally decides to dock with the embryo which is developing in utero, there are beings in attendance at that process as well. And finally, when the baby comes to be born, there's a plethora of light beings in attendance. A good friend of mine, very, very recently, a young woman, sent me a photograph. She was heavily pregnant herself, but she sent me this photograph, and literally there's this shaft of light. There are other people in the photograph, but this shaft of light is just totally focused on this young woman, and it's focused. She has her hand on her belly, just like this, and there's a shaft of light focused on it. So I wrote to her immediately, and I said, if you have any doubt that this little baby is not being attended by light beings, or that the birth itself will not be attended by light beings, you can dispel all those fears at this stage. So every little baby is born with that energy. We think that there's only one midwife or one gynecologist present at the birth process. That's ridiculous. There are ancestors of that little child, and there are angelic beings and mentors for that little baby, all in attendance at the birth process. So we're not alone at that stage. As we live our life, having been born, we're never alone during life. There's at least one other great part in attendance. There's the Atman for our Jiva, because the soul bifurcates at incarnation. There's a part that experiences incarnation, and Hinduism will call it the Jiva, and there's the part that's watching from a distance called Atman. And they're constantly in communication. But even in that process, there are angelic beings and mentors who are assisting every single one of us in the life process. We are never alone, no matter even it feels like that. And that's true not just at an individual level. Every time that there's a significant relationship in your life, there's another mentor for that relationship. It's not just that, if I have a relationship with Jean, her angel being and my angel being are cooperating with each other. It's not just that. There's a third entity which is in charge of the relationship. So every significant relationship in your life has its own angelic being or its own mentor in attendance. Every family system, the entire family system, qua family, has its own special angelic avatar being in charge of it. It's true of the clan. It's true of the tribe, it's true of the nation, it's true of the species, it's true of the planet, it's true of the galaxy, and it's true of the cosmos. At every level, a new level of soul is assisting the entire process. So it is impossible to be alone. Now, the question then becomes, how do we access that? Because there's a prime directive at work here. None of these beings, none of these great angelic assistants are free to intervene. They're not going to live your life for you. They're prepared to live your life with you. They're not prepared to do it for you. They're prepared to do it with you. But they have to be called in. They're never going to interfere. They're never going to impose themselves. You have total free will to do it in life any way you want to. So we need to call them in. How do we call them in? We call them in by attention, by intention, by meditation, by prayer, and by altering our states of consciousness. We have to appeal for them before they get involved in the process. It's a hands-off unless you want me to be involved in this process. So some form of ongoing interdimensional communication, whether you call it an altered state of consciousness or prayer or meditation, but it involves attention to it and the intention of it, and then they're there for us. So what are the great sins that we commit then as human beings? I don't believe that sin is the breaking of a commandment or the infraction of a precept. That's like a second order, third order derivative. There's only basically one sin, and there are all the smaller sins that come from that. And basically the only sin is to stay asleep. It is the only sin. We came down here with a mission and we're sleeping at the wheel. And we're determined to stay sleeping at the wheel because it takes too much work to wake up. That's the only sin, to stay asleep. We came down here and our object was to see, could we remember who God was? To come down here and remember, could I remember who I was? That I'm not just a human being with an Irish accent. I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a bite-sized piece of God, having an incarnational experience. To remember that when I'm still incarnated. To remember who my neighbour is. And my neighbour is everything and everybody. The other bite-sized pieces of God. And to remember what my mission was. And my mission was to try to wake up and to try to put my shoulder to the wheel of human evolution to move it into Christ consciousness. So the sins then are to lose hope. To say the world is in such terrible shape, what's the point? Give up, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Or to give in and to feed the anxiety you feel. Or to feel the anger you have. Or to feel the xenophobia. Or to feel the violence against anybody. In fact, the sin is to regard anybody as the enemy. That's the worst sin of all. There are no enemies. There are just other souls on safari trying to make sense of their experience and in their own way trying to move the process forward. And the best way to get rid of an enemy is to befriend them and to make them a sister or a brother for you. So I'd just end with this. Personally, the way I start every single morning, when I wake up in the morning and I open my eyes, I start with this prayer dedication. So I say, thank you, God, for the miracle of a brand new day in which I can attempt to be a channel of love, of light and of logos, of life and of laughter, of wisdom and information for our planet and for our times. Namaste. Teresa.
I just wanted to thank you for saying about how there is an angel for each relationship or family or clan. My mother was Brazilian, and I have lived 5 years of my life in Brazil. And after college, I spent some time there. And one day I walked into my aunt's house, and everyone was gathered around the table, and they were doing the Brazilian equivalent of a Ouija board, which they would do with an upside-down drinking glass. And each person would put their finger on the glass. And they had called in my grandfather. And at one point, they asked, "Who are you?" Mm-hmm. And he said, "I'm everyone's guardian angel." And it just felt like such a blessing in that moment. And it's something that I have treasured, of course, since then. But, you have a single experience, but the idea that, of course, my mind hadn't gone further, that there is this web, to use Karen's word from earlier, and it just, it reminds us of the divine.
That's beautiful.
Thanks,
Teresa. Thanks a million. It's so true. We're literally, we're God's web. We're God's world wide web. We're all connected to everything else. And it's only a question of, are there some kind of rituals like your family did in Brazil? What kind of rituals can we enact in order to establish the conscious connection to the reality? And so sometimes we do it through sacraments, we do it through Eucharist, we do it through reading, we do it through meditation, time spent in nature, watching the eyes of a newborn. There are lots of practices, but it has to be a regular practice because these are available, but they will never intervene without our permission and without our asking. So it becomes so important for us that we develop routines and rituals to keep that dialogue open constantly.
It made me remember one of my habits, which when I go for a walk out in nature, and I sing that you are the face of God or something like that to a tree or a bird or whatever.
Beautiful.
That's
good. And it's absolutely true. So this is not just some kind of a California woo-woo. This is the Great Dane from Denmark. So it's absolutely true. Everything is alive. Everything is spirit. And that's one of the first lessons I learned when I went to Africa. Having spent 8 years in the seminary training to go to Africa and kind of convert the natives, from their darkness and bring them to the light of Christ, realizing that these people were much more spiritual than what I'd come from. Or for us, spirituality was a Sunday thing. You went to Mass. For these people, it was in every oak tree, it was in every mountain, it was in every stream that they recognized that. The Aborigines in Australia believed that all of creation came into being when the ancestors sang it into being. So every feature in the landscape had its own music, had its own song. And you would never, as an Aborigine in Australia, you would never attempt to cross a desert or to climb a mountain or to forge a stream whose music you didn't know and couldn't sing. So you had to establish this connection with the ancestors before you would attempt, any kind of interaction with it. That's beautiful, Pat. Beautiful.
So with all of the souls that are here, it's way more crowded than we think it is,
Totally.
right? And so I know that there have been experiments done on computers where a computer will act differently if there's a person in the room than it, and that's supposed to be an inanimate object. So is that like a soul in the computer, or like does your car have a soul in it in your home?
That's brilliant. That's a great question. Personally, I believe that, so for me, there are two kinds of intelligence in any organism, whether the organism is a banana slug or a human being. There's the native intelligence of the organism itself as it just develops evolutionarily. But the agenda of that intelligence is survival and reproduction. That's the agenda. So the basic organism, on it left to its own devices, it operates under these two directives: survive and propagate the species. When the soul docks with the organism, you now have two different intelligences dancing together. The agenda of the soul is very different. The agenda of the soul is unconditional love and unity consciousness. The soul does not see itself as discretely, separately opposite from other souls. So it's a very, very different agenda. So it's unity consciousness and unconditional love, now dancing in a spacesuit, an organism which is about survival and reproduction. Now they have to dance together. There has to be some kind of a working agreement between the two during incarnation. And the compromise, I would call it, is compassion. That the organism begins to adapt to the realization that it's not just about me surviving or propagating myself, and I can't quite get to the place of unconditional love, and a connection with I can't quite make that leap yet, but I can move into actually compassion for other beings. So that's the dance that typically happens between the two intelligences. Now, having said that, a soul could decide to animate any object whatsoever. So if we were, for instance, to come up with an artificial intelligence machine which would pass the Turing test. Turing was a very famous British mathematician during the World War II who created a test whereby you could try to figure out whether, if you were on the phone, whether the one at the other side of the phone was a machine that had been really, really well programmed or was a human being. So how would you determine? So it's called the Turing test. So it may be at some stage that very sophisticated artificial intelligence. Now, could they have souls? I don't see any reason why they could not. If there's any degree of self-awareness, the ultimate test, of the presence of the soul is self-awareness. Now, self-awareness is present on a total gradient. Rocks have a level of self-awareness. Otherwise, they would not be able to respond biochemically to the weather, to the sun, to the wind, to the soil. There's some measure of self-awareness that allows a rock to determine what's good for the rock and what's not good for the rock. Do lilies have a level of self-awareness? They obviously do. Lilies are able to orient themselves towards the sunlight. They're able to extract minerals from the soil, take what's of value, and not take what they don't want. So there's some level of self-awareness. So the ultimate test of evolution is the degree of self-awareness we have. And the ultimate degree of self-awareness is to realize that you're God and drag, that everything that exists is simply God and drag. And so when Gaia volunteered to breed life on this little rock, until she threw up a species which was able to identify the fact that it was divine and that all the other species that inhabited the rock with it were also divine, that was her trajectory. So it's the increase in self-awareness that determines. So to the extent that there's a level of self-awareness, in that sense, it can be ensouled or animated. Whether that's an artificial intelligence like a computer, or whether it's just simply even a single cell in the body. Every single cell in your body has an elimination system, an endocrine system, a cardiovascular system, a respiratory system. It has everything that the entire organism has. So there's obviously some kind of an intelligence responding to the environment of the cell, allowing it to that. So even a cell has some level of self-awareness. And if everything on the planet is composed of cells of some kind, then it has some kind of intelligence. So when I leave my compound, anytime I leave my compound, so we're driving out this morning, and it's an automatic gate. We go over a kind of a hidden ramp, and the gate opens in. And when I'm leaving up there, the last thing I do as I leave the compound, I offer it namaste, because it's a piece of steel and wood that have intelligence. The prayer I make is, take me and return me safely. And as I come back to the compound this evening with God's help, I'll bow to the gate as the gate is opening in front of me. And I say, thank you for taking us and returning us safely. So it's composed of, atoms, and the atoms have some level of intelligence, and is fabricated into some kind of a machine, so it has some kind of intelligence. So is that a soul? If it's an animating principle that's allowing it the intelligence of operating current, or even if it's kind of pre-programmed conditions, for me, there's a soul of some kind in there. So there's nothing, as far as I'm concerned, that's not alive. There's nothing on the planet which is not alive. And therefore there's nothing on the planet which isn't ensouled in some fashion. Now, the level of self-awareness, that's a different matter. Ria.
I would like to go back to what you were talking about, baptism.
Okay.
So, the whole idea with, like take Freud and the baby's a tabula rasa, and in your case, the baby is born into this evil primordial soup. So what would be the point of baptism? Because this primordial soup has been created by the people in the world, so who could actually, is there a point to it? And that idea, to me, is very depressing.
Okay.
So what would be the hope for someone?
Great questions, Ria.
Thanks.
And so I want to differentiate. I didn't say that the baby is just born into a primordial evil soup. The baby is born into a situation which has been created by all the ancestries. There's a lot of love out there. There's a lot of beauty out there. There's a lot of love from the family of origin. All that's part of the mix. So it's not like we're born into this gunk where the child doesn't have a chance to begin with. The child is born into a world in which it's going to savour all sides of it. Depending on the family of origin, it's going to savour more light than dark, perhaps, or more dark than light. Depending on the era of human history, they're going to savour more light than dark. So it's not just this big, dirty, gunky pool. There's light and there's darkness in this pool. So that's the first part, the first differentiation. The second one is, I love this notion, that does a child come in tabula rasa? What's the point of baptism? For me, actually, I believe that the child is baptized in the waters of the womb. I believe that when we take a child into a church and we pour water and the congregation is around, that's just a celebration of the fact that the planet has received a new prophet or a new prophetess. Because every child, for me, is a reminder of who we really, really are. They're so close to source, they've just come. And so they're prophets and prophetesses to us to try to wake up the parents. The parents are there to kind of protect the spacesuit. The children are coming in to try to reveal the spirit. So as parents, we're not just there to take care of the child, we're there to learn from the child, to open ourselves up to what the child is revealing. So I'm totally convinced that it is the waters of the womb, when the amniotic fluid, that's what baptizes the baby, and that the practice of taking them into a church and pouring water on their heads and saying a formula, that's just the kind of the societal recognition of the fact that we have received a new prophetess or a new prophet. But unfortunately, we think it's just a cutesy little ceremony to give the child a new name. Yeah, go ahead, Ria.
And this is in Ireland,
Right.
It's 24th of December, the boy was born on the 24th of December, he's called Noel, the baptism's 2 days later, I knew nothing about it. Really cold Irish church, right? It put the fear of death into me. Do you help this person cast out the devil? And so in the Catholic Church, it's not, what you're saying is it's a welcoming ceremony to the world, but in Catholicism, it's not that. It's scary stuff.
Totally. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. That's the reason why we're sitting. That's the reason why we're sitting here rather than down the road. I'm only being slightly facetious. You're absolutely right, because not only did they demonize the child coming in with original sin, they demonized the mother. You know Ireland as well as I do. There was a thing called churching the mother, where very often, in case the child died soon after birth with original sin on its soul and got sent to limbo for all eternity, they'd have to baptize the child as quickly as possible. And very often the mother couldn't even attend. Yes, she's still recuperating from the birth process. So they rushed the child away, baptized the child, and then about a week later, when the mother was able, she'd come to the church. She couldn't receive communion. She'd have to wait until Mass was finished, and then very shamefacedly, she'd present herself at the back of the church, and the priest would go down, and he'd church her. He'd forgive her for the sin of conceiving, carrying, and birthing a baby, and hope that she'd learn better the next time. Yeah? And then next Sunday, she could receive communion. She could join then the rest of the kind of the saints, because her sin had been forgiven her. And it was called the churching ceremony. So it was even bad. Not only was the baby kind of demonized for having original sin, the mother was demonized, you're not for giving birth to the child. But still you couldn't practice artificial contraception. So you had to keep doing it, and keep getting churched. So what's the kind of the logic of that thing? Yeah. And keep sinning, yeah. So Vicky and then Tom.
So all the souls that you speak about, are they all capable of love in the way that some souls are capable of love?
That's brilliant, Vicky. Souls are love. Souls are liquid love. They're literally the distillation of the heart of God. So there is no soul which is other than love. But when we incarnate, we have 4 limitations. The soul has 4 limitations. Firstly, it's now allied to an organism with an agenda of survival and reproduction. Secondly, it's lost its cosmic awareness. It's now operating from this little 3-pound mass of wetware we carry between our ears. Because of that, it's subject to chronology. We have to invent time, because the brain now isn't big enough to appreciate the entire gestalt. So we have to break it up into little bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. Time does not exist outside of the physical arena. Then we have this, we are cosmic in our reach. There was no space limitations for us. Now we're confined to this tiny little body, a little embryonic form, or a new baby. And to compound things completely, we have amnesia for who we really are. We forget. There's a great little Jewish story again, that when a baby is, just before the baby is born, the angel of night, called Ayala, it pinches the baby's nostrils and makes an indentation on its upper lip. So that's why you have an indentation here and here, to create amnesia for who you really are. Because part of the journey of incarnation is to figure it out and to wake up to it. So you're not given the answers to the exam. You have to figure out the answers yourself. And so, but there's not the slightest hint of darkness in a soul. A soul is pure love, pure distillation of God's love, until it encounters the spacesuit and the world, and then all bets are off. Tom was next.
So, Seán, talking about asleep and awake. Okay. So sometimes I hear you say that, and I feel it's like a toggle switch. Am I either asleep or awake?
Brilliant.
But most of the time, I feel I'm somewhere in between.
Brilliant.
So that's for question number 1, just to expand on that a little bit. Question number 2 is, resources, cars, houses, what have you. When I accumulate these resources, I feel like I'm moving towards a sleep.
Okay.
So, just talk a little bit about that in terms of,
sure.
we're incredibly lucky to live where we live in this environment, and it's easy to be asleep.
Totally. Great question. So you're absolutely right, Tom. Awake and asleep is not a toggle switch. There's these slider switches you can have in your house where you can kind of tone down the light until you can barely see it, and then you can put it really, really, really bright. It's much more like that literally where it's a slider that we wake up more or we sleep more. So it's a question of then, so it's not just on or off, it's a slider. How far up and how far down do we go? So the second question then, where do resources get in the way of us? So there's a difference between resources that allow us to perform the mission and resources that inhibit us from performing the mission. So are we owned by our possessions, or do we possess what we own? So for instance, it's interesting to me that the average American householder today owns 57 slaves. Slaves. The average American householder today owns 57 slaves. In this sense, what ended the slave trade, in the 1800s whatsoever, was not a great spiritual insight. There was some of that. It was the Industrial Revolution. We didn't need slaves anymore to do our agricultural work, the harvest, to clean house for us, to cook our meals for us. So if you take the appliances in the typical American household, it literally is the equivalent of having 57 personal slaves to do your work for you. So it was literally a blessing of the Industrial Revolution that made slavery redundant. We didn't need them as much. It would have still continued, in spite of the abolitionists, I believe, if there hadn't been the mechanization that allowed people to not need slaves, because now we had appliances. So at what stage then do appliances become an encumbrance? Do they make us fall asleep? Or are there resources, for instance, that have ended or abolished slavery? So there's the great balance. In order to live my life and perform my mission, which resources are actually enabling me to do that, and which resources are getting in the way of me doing that? And that's a person-to-person call, and maybe an era-specific of a lifetime. At some stages of your life, you may need more resources or less resources. So it's to make that call. If you wake up every day with the intention to ask God that you be a channel of love, of light, and of logos, of life, and of laughter, or wisdom, information for the planet and the time, what resources do you need today in order to make that happen and for you to be awake? And where are the resources you've accumulated getting in the way of that and putting you back to sleep? Yeah. Margaret.
Well, this might be a dumb question. I want to go back to the angel business. I talked to my guardian angel, and I know, and I've heard that you have to ask if you want something, you have to ask. So you have to ask and talk to your guardian angel. Well, I worry about my family, so I don't like that asking business. I ask my guardian angel to wake up the guardian angels of my I mean, I'm serious.
Okay.
I mean, can I do that?
Margaret, go ahead. I finished.
Well, according to your idea, I mean, I don't think that they're going to talk to their guardian angel. And I want them to, and I want my guardian angel to, I told you.
Okay. I have two responses to that. The first one is, you need to start a trade union for guardian angels. And make sure they're doing what they're being paid to do. Okay. Yeah, that's the joke. In all seriousness, every single one of us comes into life, Margaret, and we all have our own particular contract. We all have particular lessons we're going to learn. But overall, we've been given free will. We're free, to do or not to do. But we've surrounded ourselves with family and with relationships, where we're helping each other. We're trying to cue each other in. So it's rather like, improv theater, where you're on stage with somebody else, and depending on the cues you give to your partner, they're going to respond accordingly. But they're always free to do it well or to do it badly. So I know you'd like to knock really, really hard and say, are you asleep? Can you see what my kids are doing? Get their guardian angels on it already. The guardian angels, I guarantee you, are much more aware and much more in love with your family than you, Margaret, are with your family. They're totally aware. They will never intervene and break free. Free will is the prime directive they want. So they realize they're doing exactly what they're able to do and what they're permitted to do, and the kids have to respond accordingly. And if it's going to take the kids 3 more lifetimes, maybe they're going to have Teresa as a mother the next time, and she'll shake the daylights out of them.
But don't they have to ask?
Yes, they do. But the thing is, they're hearing from others as well. There are mentors in this lifetime. There are family members in this lifetime. They're getting cues. They're getting the karmic feedback from their actions. All these are invitations to all of us to try to wake up. So there are lots of ways in which we're being invited to wake up, but we're free to choose to listen or not to listen. And as I said to you, time is an illusion created by our physical articulation. There is no such thing as time. In God's space, there is no time. So, your family are fully awake, already fully awake. It's just not, it hasn't percolated down to the physical body right yet. There's a level at them which they're souls, therefore they're totally loving beings. That's their essence. But in their incarnational journey, they're subject to time, and it's going to happen, at their pace. So even when you pray for them, it's important to realize at the end of prayer, you have to realize it has to be in God's timing and God's methodology. I can't impose my timeline And my method, I want you to wake up, and I want you to wake up tomorrow at 10:30, and I want it to happen in this particular fashion. I can't do that. Even when I pray, I have to say, okay, that's an agreement between the soul and God, and it's going to happen in the optimal time, because there is no time. I'm operating from the constricture of believing there is a timeline here. They got to get it before they die, or they got to get it before I die. I'm going to be really pissed if I could close the coffin and talk to myself, and they're still not enlightened. Yeah, that's an artificial imposition of time. Yeah, Ingrid. We'll let you finish up, Ingrid. We're 10 after 11. Yeah.
Well, I really love the Dowsers, and they really do know how to work with Gaia. They totally believe she's a conscious living entity and an amazing, beautiful creation and creator. And I got a book at the Dowsers, and it was called Self-Healing and Dowsing. And it was this compendium. It was like 3 inches thick. And it's incorporated over 2,000 books and workshops. And I knew I fell in love with it when it talked about MBOs right off the bat. But it talks about quantum living. And it says every day, like you start your day, you say hello to yourself and to the world and to the day. And you design your day a little bit. And you ask, how may I be of service? How may I fulfill my mission, my purpose? And then you invite magic and mystery. And you allow all of these potentials, these quantum fields, to come to you because you're willing to be out in the world, being who you are to the best of your ability, but to invite the magic, the mystery, and your higher self to live your day in your best way.
That's beautiful, Ingrid. And just to make sure that, when Ingrid uses the phrase the MBO, she means most benevolent outcome, that all prayer should be most benevolent outcome. And I just want to say a word about magic. We have this weird notion in the West that magic is about guys with big pointy hats and wands. It's not that at all. It's seeing to the core of how the universe is actually set up. So when Christ performed miracles, if you were to say to me, do you believe in miracles? I'd have to say to you, define miracle. If you think that God sometimes indulges the prayers of holy people by changing his intended outcome, I don't believe in miracles. But if by miracle you believe that the universe is a much, much more complex place than we give it credit for, and that the great avatars, the Christ figures, they knew, the depths of the complexity of the universe in which we find ourselves, and they knew how to play within that rule system. And when you play within that rule system and you know the rules, extraordinary things happen. And so they call it magic. But magic, in some senses, has a kind of a pejorative context in the West. Magic literally means knowing the intricacies of the complexity of God's creation and knowing how to play according to the rules of that. We'll leave it at that because it's 10 past 11. Thank you so much. So let's offer each other a sign of our peace before we continue.